Thanks very much, and good morning, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking AMMF for inviting me to come here today and talk about the cholangiocarcinoma data project we've been working on. So this project has been a large collaborative effort on behalf of many colleagues who are listed on the slide, who I'd like to thank for their input. So as many in this room will be aware, cholangiocarcinoma is a rare biliary tract cancer that encompasses 3 distinct subtypes that have different pathophysiology, symptom profiles, approaches to clinical management and prognosis. On the whole, cholangiocarcinoma is asymptomatic in early disease, and as a result, most people will present late and giving them limited treatment options and correspondingly poor survival outcomes. And due to the difficulty of diagnosing and treating cholangiocarcinoma, it's been hypothesized that variation in the diagnosis and management of cholangiocarcinoma may exist across England, which could contribute to the poor outcomes that are experienced by some. However, there's little data in a UK setting that can evidence whether such variation exists. So AMMF instigated a multi-phase research project to provide an evidence base from which to make the case for improvements in care, ultimately with the goal of improving outcomes. So as part of the wider cholangiocarcinoma project, a number of sub-studies have been undertaken. And these studies focused on different elements of the cholangiocarcinoma care pathway with the aim of understanding whether there was evidence of either regional, socioeconomic or temporal variation across England. And we looked at incidence, routes to diagnosis, treatment and mortality. So incidence and mortality were measured as age standardized rates in the general population. And for those who aren't aware, routes to diagnosis are defined based on an established algorithm applied to routine data to trace back from diagnosis and determine the route and the source of a diagnosis. So this could be an emergency presentation, a 2-week wait urgent GP referral for investigation for cancer, other types of GP referral, and other routes that included inpatients, outpatients, and diagnosis only made on the death certificate. And we compare proportions of these different routes amongst people with cholangiocarcinoma. In terms of treatments, we looked at the percentage of people that received surgery, chemotherapy, or stent insertion in the 12 to 15 months following diagnosis. So this has obviously been a large body of work taken place over a number of years, so I won't have time to go through all the findings in detail today, but we'll summarize some key findings from across all of the different studies. So the project was conducted in partnership with the National Disease Registration Service, NHS Digital, and Health Data Insight, as Helen has mentioned. And among the data sets that we used were those collated and maintained by the NDRS, namely the National Cancer Registration Dataset and the Systemic Anti-Cancer Therapy Dataset, as well as other linked health data sources, so hospital episode statistics and ONS mortality data. The periods of the studies were different due to data availability, so incidence and mortality could be assessed from 2001 to 2017. Routes to diagnosis were assessed from 2006 to 2017, and treatment could be assessed from 2014 to 2017. And we also had information on patients and tumour characteristics for registered cholangiocarcinoma cases that are listed on the slide. So age, sex, deprivation quintile, comorbidities and liver disease, as well as tumour subtype and morphology. And the Cancer Alliance of Residents at Diagnosis was our measure of geographic variation. So the first findings actually relate to the data itself. So as we've already mentioned, there are 3 clinically recognized subtypes of cholangiocarcinoma: intrahepatic, perihilar, and distal. And these subtypes present differently, have different symptom profiles, as Shahid has mentioned, and can expect to have different routes to diagnosis and treatment options. Currently, it's not possible to accurately distinguish these subtypes with the available coding systems used in the National Cancer Registration System dataset. So perihilar is often inconsistently coded as or incorrectly coded as intrahepatic cholangiocarcinoma. And this can have findings on the results of analyses if trying to understand differences by subtype. For example, incidence and mortality rates of intrahepatic cholangiocarcinomas may be skewed. There have been recent changes made to ICD-11 and ICD-04 coding systems to try and rectify this, but these are currently unavailable in the National Cancer Registration dataset. So for the purposes of our analysis, we had to define broad CCA subtypes as intrahepatic, extrahepatic, and other cholangiocarcinomas, as shown on the slide. We found the information on stage diagnosis was relatively incomplete in the National Cancer Registration dataset, and particularly when compared to other cancer sites. So the figure on the slide shows the completeness of the stage diagnosis field for different tumor types, with cholangiocarcinoma in blue, markedly lower than other gastrointestinal cancers that the NDRS publish on. Stage is going to play a major role in determining treatment options, with curative treatment only being an option in early stage disease. And it's obviously known to be important for cholangiocarcinoma, where many patients present at an advanced stage of cancer. So for our analysis, we'd ideally want to be able to evidence the latest presentation, monitor changes over time, and account for stage when looking at differences in treatments received. But unfortunately, we were unable to do this as well as we would have liked. Okay. So moving on to describe incidence. So nearly 30,000 cholangiocarcinomas were diagnosed between 2001 and 2017 in England. And the number diagnosed per year increased from just over 1,000 to 2,334 in 2017. And on the graph, we have the age-standardized incidence rate of cholangiocarcinoma over this period, alongside other biliary tract cancers as comparators. We can see that the incidence rate of cholangiocarcinoma far exceeds either gallbladder or ampulla of Vater. And a clearly increasing trend was seen from 2.9 per 100,000 population to 4.5 per 100,000 population for cholangiocarcinoma, with less obvious increases seen for other biliary tract cancers. And of note, an age-standardized incidence rate of 6 per 100,000 is the threshold above which we'd start to consider cancers no longer a rare cancer. This increase in incidence in cholangiocarcinoma was largely due to intrahepatic cholangiocarcinomas, with less marked increases in extrahepatic cholangiocarcinomas. And we observed more steeply increasing incidence rates in those who were most deprived, particularly between 2004 and 2016, which has meant that the gap in incidence between the least and most deprived in England has actually increased over time. And as Helen and Shahid have both previously mentioned, we found that cholangiocarcinoma was not exclusively a disease of the elderly, in that just over a fifth of those with cholangiocarcinoma were aged below 65 at diagnosis. And we actually found males tended to be diagnosed with cholangiocarcinoma at a younger age than females on average. So when looking at routes of diagnosis, we are primarily interested in emergency presentation and two-week wait referral routes. Two-week wait referral routes speak to the appropriate recognition of potential cancer symptoms in primary care and onward referral and a well-managed pathway, whereas emergency presentations are often viewed as a suboptimal route to diagnosis associated with late presentation and often poorer outcomes. So emergency presentation was the most common route to diagnosis among cholangiocarcinoma patients over the period studied, but we did see declines from 51% to 46%. We also saw declines in diagnosis via other routes, which encompassed inpatients, outpatients, and death certificate. And the proportion of two-week wait referrals actually doubled over the time period from 10 to 20%. As well as temporal variation in two-week wait and emergency presentation routes, we saw geographic variation. So the graphs on the slide are funnel plots showing the percentage of individuals in each cancer alliance diagnosed via each route, as a percentage point difference from the population average. So each dot on the graphs is a cancer alliance, and the y-axis represents the percentage point difference from the population average, which is represented by the horizontal black line. Cancer alliances are ordered by size from left to right, so smaller cancer alliances are on the left and bigger cancer alliances on the right. And the dashed lines represent significance thresholds, such that any cancer alliances either above the upper lines or below the lower lines will be considered to significantly vary from the population average and could be considered outliers. So we can see that we have a number of cancer alliances with a significantly lower proportion of people diagnosed by a 2-week wait than average, and correspondingly a significantly higher proportion diagnosed via emergency presentation than average across England. And these results are adjusted for patient and tumour factors listed on the bottom of the slide. Okay, so moving on to our analysis of treatment. We likewise saw wide geographic variation in the probability of receiving a stent insertion. So the bar graph on the left of the slide gives the unadjusted proportions that received a stent insertion in the 21 cancer alliances in England, and this ranged from 16 to 42% across the country. And on the right, again, we see another funnel plot presenting adjusted percentages, and we can see that there is wide variation of up to 15% above and below the population average across cancer alliances, and that a number of cancer alliances had a lower proportion of people receiving stent insertion than average. And whilst some variation in the proportion who received surgery and chemotherapy was also observed, this was not as large as the variation in stent insertion. So we found that half of individuals in our treatment cohort had no evidence of surgery, chemotherapy, or stent insertion. And the reasons for not receiving treatment aren't explicitly recorded in the National Cancer Registration dataset. And obviously we didn't have much information on stage or other clinical indicators like performance status that makes it difficult to determine the characteristics of those who are untreated and why they might not have received treatment. However, we did note very high mortality in the 6 months following diagnosis for those who didn't receive treatment, which could suggest these are a cohort who present very late and very unwell and have few treatment options available to them. So, in parallel with increases in incidence, the age-standardized mortality rate due to cholangiocarcinoma has increased over time. And again, on the slide, we're showing this in comparison to other biliary tract cancers for comparison. And we can see a much steeper increase for cholangiocarcinomas as compared to others. Again, this increase was largely represented by increases in intrahepatic cholangiocarcinomas, with no significant increase in extrahepatic, and in fact, a small decrease in the mortality rate of extrahepatic cholangiocarcinomas. And again, the mortality rate due to cholangiocarcinoma was highest for those who were most deprived over the time period. Okay. So to summarize the findings to date, so the AMMF has already worked with the World Health Organization, as you've heard, to introduce new codes for distal and perihilar cholangiocarcinoma. And this is going to improve our ability to understand the epidemiology, management, and outcomes of the 3 distinct cholangiocarcinoma subtypes better in future. This study has evidenced increasing incidence of cholangiocarcinoma in England, as has been seen elsewhere, with widening variation by deprivation and a younger age profile in men than in women. An emergency presentation is unfortunately still the most common route to diagnosis for cholangiocarcinoma, but 2-week wait diagnosis has increased over time. And the geographic and temporal variation in diagnosis routes suggests there's opportunities for sharing of good practice across organisations to continue and hopefully further improve on recent trends that have been seen. Earlier recognition and diagnosis is vital for preserving treatment options and improving outcomes. And a challenge to this is that cholangiocarcinoma often presents with vague or non-specific symptoms. It's hoped that these data encourage greater awareness amongst the public and clinical communities of what is an increasingly frequent cancer in the population. So a high proportion of patients weren't treated with surgery, chemotherapy, or a stent insertion that we could find evidence of. An extremely high short-term mortality in those without these treatments suggests this could be playing a role. However, due to the low completeness of clinical information, such as stage and performance status, we weren't able to investigate this in detail. And the reasons for lower stage completeness compared to other tumour types are unknown. If we could improve capture of stage at diagnosis, this would have a large benefit for evidencing variation in treatment and outcomes and monitoring changes over time. Large geographic variation in the probability of stent insertion could be evidence of true differences in clinical practice across the country, but could also be explained by differences in coding or clinical case mix that we weren't able to account for. So more local review of treatment pathways where detailed clinical information is available could be beneficial, and more comprehensive guidelines for the management of cholangiocarcinoma could help to reduce potential variation in treatments received. And finally, to finish on, the increasing mortality due to cholangiocarcinoma that has kept pace with incidence shows that mortality hasn't improved for cholangiocarcinoma over time. And this emphasises just how important it is to achieve improvements in its diagnosis and management. So in terms of next steps, we are currently preparing manuscripts for publication to disseminate these findings more widely. Some of the early learning around defining the subtypes for cholangiocarcinoma within the National Cancer Registration dataset is now being used to inform future routine reporting for liver and cholangiocarcinomas in the National Disease Registration Service, and this is via the Get Data Out programme. So it's hopeful that in future we'll have routine reporting on some of these metrics going forward in the public domain. And now AMMF have this data to inform discussions around improving outcomes and reducing variation in care for cholangiocarcinoma. Okay, thank you for listening.